Welcome to Friday night's video in our Master Series. This is the 45th video in our Master Series. This is the 15th video in our first phase processing and the 4th video in our effects step of our first phase processing. I wanted to address something really quick. We're going to talk about a couple different effects and a couple different processors to use as effects that are basically not are being used as effects rather than steps we're going to be doing in processing. Because when we get done with doing effects, we're going to go into equalization. Equalization, trying to make a track sound as good as possible, or whatever you're doing. We're doing single track processing at the moment, is different than using it as effect. Same if you're using compression or upwards compression as an effect, upwards expansion or expansion as an effect, using ADSR work as an effect on some word or a phrase or a verse or something like that, bodybuilding, trying to build body and things like that, doubling track, spatialization. We talked about before about like moving stereo fields as effects and things like that that are part of the spatialization step in first phase processing. So you have to remember that all these things that we're getting ready to go into after we get done doing effects, that those are different than trying to use it as an effect. We are trying to enhance the audio with this stuff down here to make it sound as good as possible. But those things can also be used as an effect. We won't really get much into bodybuilding and doubling tracks, but when we get there, just remember doing those things in different ways when we get to those steps. You can also go back and see them as effects because you can do them a little differently for one verse or one word or one chorus or one, whatever, or one bridge or, one movement or transition or break or anything, that they can be used also as effects in different ways, because you might be going through and doing your bodybuilding and your spatialization, but you go back, and after we get through this first phase processing, you might want to look at it also as an effect, to where you're going, no, I want to, at this one part in this vocal, this one word, I want to do this really cool doubling of the track and spatialization and bodybuilding to make and give it this stereo effect and moving stereo field thing going on. Just kind of keep that in mind, that all those things can be also used as an effects. Because as we're talking about effects, that simply that each one of these can be used as that. Now, I'm not going to get into all of the ways that could be done, but I'm even in simple things like reverberation, that there's a difference between using it as an effect than using it when we do spatialization. When we get to reverberation and spatialization, we want to give the track a sound that the whole performance has some kind of spatial setting, and most of the time we want that to be the same on all the other tracks for the most part, so it sounds like it's in this place. Does that make sense? So sometimes a little bit more and a little bit less to make things go front to back so they sound farther back. You reduce volume and put a little more reverb on them. Sometimes make them sound they're farther back than something that's out front. So there's lots of aspects of that, but we're using that a little bit differently. When we're talking about using some of these as an effect, like take reverberation, either a convolution reverb or just like a normal reverb like that, there's spring reverb, plate reverb, things like that can add an effect to where you've got one word and you get out a plugin that does plate reverb or spring reverb, or you've got an impulse response that does a spring reverb or a plate reverb or something like that, that you can put in your convolution reverb on one word or something like that to give it some kind of texture, that your you're using it as an effect, that it's going to affect that one word or that one phrase in some way, that a lot of times you want to cut that out, drag it to a different track, do all the same processing or effects that you're doing in first phase processing to that same track, except for when you go to do some other reverberation, work as we go into other steps in first phase processing, that you might not want to do it to that track because you've done some other type of reverberation processing that you used as an effect, so it might conflict with what you've done when you were trying to use reverberation as an effect. So I know that sounds funny and long-winded, but they've got two different places. I mean, a prime example is I've got a drum hit, and I've got, I'm cutting out that one drum hit that's right before the intro or a break or something, and I cut it out, drag it to a different track, and I'm putting this reverb on it, this big Taj Mahal reverb, impulse response, my convolution reverb, and I'm doubling the track, itself, because it's all into itself. It's becoming a separate project that it's like, and I automated go to come back and get louder. I'm doing volume automation to make it louder again, come back with all that reverb, and then bam, it comes in. Da, 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 the break's over. Does that make sense? These are huge things you can do. It takes experimentation, but for the most part, if you understand what the reverberation is doing and you understand what impulse response is and the frequency response inherent, and there's a couple of videos on this channel about them, and reverberation, that basically what it's trying to do is construct impulse response and a frequency response that's either an algorithm that's in the plugin itself that's basically coded in there, or it's trying to do it from some type of impulse response that has an impulse and frequency response on it, that using it in different ways, just on one word or on the tail of something, to give it some space, or, it can have it can have granular effect also to where it actually is affecting the sound. Different impulse responses and different reverbs that you may get that are just, coded reverbs running algorithms, that they can actually add flavor to it. The dampness, proximity, all kinds of things that are on it can actually cause it to have a different flavor and a different sound. And sometimes the plugin itself will affect the audio a little bit different. You need to give it a kind of a really cool sound for one section. So besides just putting it on someplace somewhere else, that, like on one word or one phrase or something like that, you got something like this Taj Mahal that you're putting right there. There's like two words on a break, and the lady's going, and then, and it's like, yeah, it's like this huge effect, because there ain't no other instruments there, and it's just her like in this huge Taj Mahal effect, yeah, and it's like, you can do that with anything like that. And and you can also filter this. You can automate these things. You can automate most of the parameters. In my DAW, you can automate most of the parameters. So finding out which parameters you can automate to do different types of effects that you can automate in different ways, that they're changing automations of those parameters to have really unique flavors. It's like even the mix of it, you can automate it to where it's just the major hit, it doesn't have a lot of reverb, but at the tail end starts getting boosted up, and you run in volume automation at the end of it to try to bring it up loud, because it's actually tailing off, but you don't want that effect. That it's a tool unto itself just for an effect, so that it can have some effect on the audio that you're using it for spatialization, but in a different way, because I look at the two uses, and you'll see later when we do spatialization and stereo field work that's not what I'm using it for here. I'm using it for an effect on something, that I'm using a reverb as an effect. And the same thing with EQ, that I may, for one section do some type of a low pass, or I might put, a low pass filter on there or something like that, and I might even automate it. I might put automation on there to where it's like, yeah, and it's going down and it starts sounding bassy, or I might reverse that, to where it's kind of faded out at the end, or I might automate it back and forth to where it does some weird thing, it's like, yeah, with the filtering. Or notch filtering. You can do the same thing with notch filtering, and notch filter someplace, and fuss with it like that it can have the same kind of an effect of it wobbling around or something in some certain frequency range, or wobbling around or rising it up, or a low pass filter that's all the way up or something like that, and you bring it down into it as the guy's talking, and all kinds of different things to use them as effects in conjunction with automation. Does that make sense? And we had talked about routing signals in different places to where you can actually do it on different channels, or on the same channel, but routed with different signals on top of each other, so that you have 2-3 different versions of it causing some type of an effect that it can get complicated, but you can do all kinds of different effects with just reverbs and EQ and any one of the other things that we're going to talking about after we get done doing the effects. Things like your compressors, expanders, your my ADSR tools, or any of those things that we're talking about, that you can use them and use them in conjunction with automation in certain phrases or words or the end of something or the beginning of something to cause some type of an effect, with those applications and those processors. And the possibilities are not, endless, but there's a lot of things you can do that can do some really good things. So basically, whenever you're thinking about them, thinking about, what that might do for one word or one phrase or just, the tail end of something or the beginning of something, and or automating that, if I automate the mix of that or, the early reflections or the low pass filter, the high pass filter, or, the ADSR, if I automate part of that to where it's doing something, and changing, as it's moving through time, that those are huge tools to use as effects. And to sit here and go through all of them would take a long time because it's just there's we are basically dealing with basic effects, but just keep in mind that all of those things can be used as effects in different ways on their own, in small sections, on small words, with automation for phrases or choruses or whatever, depending even on different instruments. It's going to have a totally different effect on what's happening that can just add some kind of cool transition effect or a break effect or something that's happening before something else starts or at the end of something, that they can add some really different type of textures to what your production is doing to make it a little bit different and unique. If you use most things, when I talk about effects, I try to say use them in a tasteful way. But there's sometimes when I'm doing something, I don't really want it. I want it raunchy and nasty and just in your face because that's the effect I'm looking for. And so, I'm trying to make it, how do I make it just sound horrible, bro? How do I mangle this audio at the end of this the way I'm thinking to where it's going to come out and doing this? I put some EQ and boomy reverb and put this ADSR tool and this compressor to compress it and get it pumping a little bit or something like that. And there's all kinds of ways to use those things, and it just takes experimentation on your part to try to fuss with them as that. You'll see once we get into out of effects and we start doing all these things, keep in mind that any one of these can be used as an effect. So you might do these doubling of tracks like I was talking about before, for the main performance, but you might switch it around a little bit as an effect for one section or one word or the end of something. And the same thing with the bodybuilding. You might build this huge spatialization effect for this one area or make it go mono or something like that. We had talked about that. Any of these things can have that effect. ADSR, transient shapers, all these kind of things we talked about when we were talking about doing editing, that they can also be an effect. At this point, when we're going through this, we're trying to make it sound as good as possible. But we're visiting it right now before we get into doing that as an effect. So when you get done with this first phase processing, just remember that as we go through that, and by the time we get done with it, that all those things we also do can also be kind of worked. They can be worked in a way to be caused as an effect, and they can be kind of worked in reverse to make things sound worse, to some point, to where you would say, well, that's what I do to make it sound good. But if I start reversing that process, what's that going to do to the audio? Is that going to be like a really different, cool effect that's going to make the instrument or the vocal sound different and unique to have this effect? And, I combine these things together, what can happen there? So that's a big, huge thing to take into consideration and experiment with them as effects. Just remember, most of these things like reverberations, equalization, and all these things we'll be going through in next steps as tools to make the audio sound better. And when we get to those, you might have to be cutting up some tracks, moving things to other tracks so that you don't adversely affect the sound scoping and effects you've done by trying to make it sound as good as possible, because that was might conflict with what you did with the effect. So just keep that in mind, because that can be an issue sometimes, and the biggest way to fix that is put something on a different track. So peace, hope, love. I hope you enjoy messing around with those and using them in effects in different areas. And I'll see you in the next video.